Joining us now is Jean-Emile Jammine from France 24. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you.
So let me begin with a question that may seem fairly obvious, but it also is far from easy from what I was told recently. Who is the real winner of these elections? Can you name a single person? And to make it slightly more challenging, specifically a politician, because I've already heard from one of our guests that the general public is the winner here. But what about the actual people who took part in the vote? Who do you think emerged victorious?
Certainly the voters for the left were the most positively surprised. In terms of an actual politician, you simply cannot name one, and that is down to the instruments of the Fifth Republic, which have been basically put on show here. The Fifth Republic, which was started after the Second World War by Charles de Gaulle, to make sure that the fringes of the political spectrum and the extremes as well never got into power, and that is through this two-day election, these 2 rounds of elections which were on show. So after that first round, the national rally under Marine Le Pen and the President Jordan Bardella did so well. They got 33%, 33.5, which was the best showing ever by a far-right party since the Second World War, and that basically galvanized the center and the left to find a way to block them. And so what they did is they, in around 200 departments, the candidate of the center or the left coalition made way for each other in terms of if they thought that they had a better shot of basically defeating the far right. So that proved highly successful. And then in the second round, that showed with the New Popular Front, this grand left coalition of 4 parties getting the most seats with 182 seats in the French National Parliament, and then Macron's party, his Renaissance party, and their centrist alliance of Le Modem, as well as the other parties who basically make up that centrist alliance. They came second, which was quite a shock considering how badly they did in the first round. And then Marine Le Pen had to basically settle for third, despite getting the best results ever for a far-right party. And so in terms of where they set out and their preconceived ideas of where they would have had to, where they would have finished, the far-right will definitely be feeling aggrieved, and that has been shown by Jordan Bardella's comments afterwards. The center will be thinking, okay, well, we got through the worst part of the storm, and now we have to make these agreements and possibly sit with a lame duck president in terms of Emmanuel Macron for the next 3 years. The left is by far the happiest because they never expected to do so well, and yet they still won't have a parliamentary majority. So in terms of an actual person, an individual feeling the happiest, it's very tough to say that anyone is really winning here. The public, though, has shown that democracy works in terms of the Fifth Republic. And you saw that in the celebrations on the streets at Place de la République with the left. Jean-Luc Mélenchon is possibly the only politician. He's the hard left firebrand leader of the France Unbowed party, the far left, well, the hard left party, who maybe feels the most emboldened after this vote.
And now you mentioned, let's say, what the centre has to say about this, and you mentioned that, well, we survived the storm. That's what they could say, and that's a great way to put it, truly. Now, having that in mind, what you just said and how you outlined the situation now, what are the main challenges that Macron now faces in forming a stable government, and how might this affect his domestic and foreign policies?
Well, the wide range of issues is absolutely gigantic because this is still uncharted territory for France in terms of what they call cohabitation. And that means really working with a political spectrum, which is certainly not aligned to yourself. The last time we saw that was with Lionel Jospin and Jacques Chirac in the 1990s, 1997 it was, where Jacques Chirac, a right-leaning president, had to deal with a leftist prime minister. And now Emmanuel Macron finds himself in a similar position. But this is significant because of the lead that France has taken in foreign policy issues of late, specifically with Gaza and even more so with Ukraine. And now Emmanuel Macron is seen as having significantly less power going into that NATO summit in just under a week in Washington. So it's quite difficult to take the mandate forward to that meeting when you are shown to not have that kind of support back home for your policies. Added to that, it's not a unanimous approach to foreign policy on the left, which now has the majority of seats, and which is now saying to Emmanuel Macron, listen, we effectively won that election and you should put one of our candidates in as prime minister, which, by the way, hasn't been chosen yet. We will touch on that later. But this is a problem for the left as well in terms of foreign policy, because on the one hand, you've got the socialists who are very much anti the war in Gaza and anti Russia in terms of the invasion of Ukraine. Then on the other side, you've got the hard left and France Unbowed, which I mentioned under Jean-Luc Mélenchon, which has very much been cool towards the situation in Ukraine. In fact, when Volodymyr Zelensky visited the French National Assembly recently, it was not only members of the far right which didn't attend, it was also members of the far left. And that just shows that they are not in terms of Ukraine as supportive as the center or even the socialists, which are part of that left coalition. And so in terms of even finding a candidate amongst the left to represent the whole broad church, it's going to certainly take a lot of deliberation, a lot of time, and there really isn't that much time because in just under 9 days is the first sitting of the French National Assembly since the elections. And in terms of Emmanuel Macron, well, he would want a resolution on that candidate before then. But it's not even clear, even if they have that candidate to present to Emmanuel Macron, whether he'll take it. Because, as of the news yesterday, he has kept Prime Minister Gabriel Attal in his position for stability reasons, despite Attal tendering his resignation after that result. So much in the air still.
So you've mentioned a weakened mandate when it comes to foreign policy. What about the constitutional side of things? For how long can President Macron maintain his vision of foreign policy? And will it be possible, A, in a situation whereby he has a government with which he doesn't totally agree, but there is some sort of broad coalition, and B, there is a case of a hard cohabitation, i.e. the ruling camp doesn't really see eye to eye with him as president. What are his options here?
Well, it's again uncharted territory and something that France is not at all familiar with in terms of simply the gravity of the situation abroad. France hasn't had to deal with such a discrepancy in terms of positions on foreign policy while there has been this misalignment between political spheres. So what that means is basically that Emmanuel Macron is now going to be presiding over a government which is very much split in foreign policy, but at a time when foreign policy is the most delicate. And in terms of what the country was thinking if the far right had gained power, which was projected in the polls, they thought that there might be less support for Ukraine, and certainly in terms of that rhetoric that Macron said about sending soldiers there to help train the Ukrainian combatants there, the Ukrainian soldiers themselves, that wouldn't happen. And it's unclear whether that would happen with the left either. And now, in terms of the actual constitutional mandate, well, Emmanuel Macron is perfectly within his right to keep Gabriel Attal as the prime minister for another year. He might feel the pressure and say, listen, the election was very clear and we have lost that mandate. But at the same time, it's not certain just what kind of pressure the left can put on Macron in terms of the instruments and the political tools that they can use to take it to the courts and say, listen, we have the full right to implement our prime minister. That's not the case. And now we're looking forward even until the presidential elections in 2027. Until then, with any kind of minority government, whether it's the left with a prime minister, whether it's the center in a grand coalition, which can stretch from Les Républicains on the center right, on the right wing, to the socialists on the left, the center left, even that would be a minority government. And it would be a minority government on the far right, but that's all null and void now. So what that means is whatever foreign policy that you try and put through, not only can it be blocked in parliament, but it can also lead to any kind of a motion of no confidence in the current sitting prime minister. And that means political deadlock ultimately. And that is the biggest worry going forward, because how can you simply pass anything, not only in terms of foreign policy, but in terms of budgetary issues going forward, something that France is facing with a lot of worry.
So, of course, we're facing a period of uncertainty, at least until a new stable government emerges, and that, as you've mentioned, may take time. Jean-Emile Jammine was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us.